She's a disgrace. Always has been. That's what my mother announced to the entire extended family when I enlisted in the Navy at 18. She said it again when I missed my cousin's wedding for basic training. And again when I chose Military Academy over coming home for Christmas. But I was there at Dad's retirement ceremony, uninvited, standing in the back corner of the VFW hall. My name is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever been cast out by your own family only to return so powerful they couldn't even look you in the eye? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The rejection started early. While my older brother Jake was quarterback of the varsity team, I was the weird kid who read military history books and did push-ups in my bedroom. While my younger sister Emma was crowned homecoming queen, I was building obstacle courses in our backyard and timing myself on rope climbs. My parents didn't understand it. They wanted normal daughters who cared about prom dresses and college boyfriends, not someone who dreamed of leading troops into combat. When I announced my intention to join the Navy during my senior year, the dinner table went silent. My father, a retired insurance salesman, put down his fork and stared at me like I'd just confessed to a crime. My mother's face went pale, then red, then pale again. She stood up so fast her chair scraped against the kitchen floor and pointed her finger at me like I was contaminated. "Absolutely not," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "No daughter of mine is going to run around playing soldier with a bunch of men. It's inappropriate, it's dangerous, and it's not what decent girls do." But I wasn't asking for permission. I was 18 and I'd already signed the papers. The recruiting officer had been impressed by my physical fitness scores and my leadership potential. He told me I had what it took to become an officer, maybe even make it to the Naval Academy, if I proved myself. My parents saw it as rebellion. I saw it as destiny. The night before I left for basic training, my mother sat me down in the living room. She'd been crying, her mascara smudged under her eyes. She grabbed my hands and squeezed them so tight it hurt. "Sarah, please," she whispered, "you're going to ruin your life. You're going to get yourself killed, or worse. No man is ever going to want to marry a woman who's been in the military. You'll never have a normal family, normal children. You'll be alone forever." I pulled my hands away and looked at her steadily. "Maybe normal isn't what I want, Mom. Maybe I want something bigger than what you think I deserve." She slapped me across the face. It wasn't hard, but it stung more than any physical pain I'd ever felt. She'd never hit me before, not once in my entire life. But the disappointment, the shame she felt about who I was choosing to become, had finally boiled over into something ugly and desperate. "You're breaking this family apart," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Your father is humiliated. Your siblings are embarrassed. Everyone at church is asking what we did wrong." I touched my cheek where her hand had connected and felt something inside me harden, not with anger, but with resolve. "I'm not breaking anything, Mom. I'm just not pretending to be someone I'm not anymore." The next morning, I left for basic training. No one came to see me off. No one called to wish me luck. I took a bus to the train station with a single duffel bag and a heart full of determination. As the train pulled away from my hometown, I watched the familiar buildings shrink into the distance and made myself a promise. I would succeed not because of my family's support, but in spite of their rejection. Basic training was brutal, but I thrived. While other recruits complained about the early morning runs and the drill instructor's constant criticism, I pushed myself harder. I volunteered for extra duties, studied military tactics in my free time, and earned the respect of my superior officers. When graduation day came, I stood at the top of my class, but I stood alone. My family didn't attend the ceremony. The Naval Academy was the next step. I'd been accepted based on my exceptional performance in basic training and my scores on the entrance exams. It was a dream come true, but when I called home to share the news, my mother's response was ice cold. "I hope you're happy," she said. "You've chosen the military over your family. Don't expect us to celebrate your decision to become something we can't be proud of." The academy was a different world. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who understood my drive, my ambition, my need to serve something greater than myself. I excelled in my studies, particularly in naval strategy and leadership. My professors noticed my potential early on. Admiral Henderson, who taught advanced tactical operations, pulled me aside after class one day. "Mitchell," he said, his weathered face serious. "You have something special, the kind of strategic mind that comes along once in a generation. But more than that, you have the courage to make the hard decisions. That's what separates good officers from great ones." I threw myself into every challenge. I led my dormitory to victory in the annual War Games simulation. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in international relations and military strategy. I was commissioned as an ensign, then quickly promoted to lieutenant junior grade, then lieutenant commander. Each promotion was earned through merit, through late nights studying intelligence reports, through leading my sailors through dangerous missions that others weren't willing to take on. But with each success, the silence from home grew louder. I sent letters updating my family on my achievements, my promotions, my decorations. They went unanswered. I called on birthdays and holidays, but the conversations were stilted, awkward, filled with long pauses and barely concealed disapproval. My mother would ask about my plans to settle down, completely ignoring the fact that I'd just been selected for advanced training at the Naval War College. My father would change the subject whenever I mentioned my latest assignment or the commendations I'd received. Jake and Emma seemed uncomfortable whenever I was mentioned, as if my very existence was an embarrassment they had to endure. During one particularly painful Christmas phone call, my mother finally said what she'd been thinking for years. "Sarah, we love you, but we can't pretend to understand the choices you've made. You've become someone we don't recognize, someone who doesn't fit into our family anymore." I hung up the phone and sat in my quarters aboard the USS Constellation, staring out at the dark ocean. I was hundreds of miles from shore, surrounded by sailors who would follow me into battle without question, but I'd never felt more alone. My family had made their choice. They'd chosen their comfort, their conventional expectations, their need for a daughter who fit their definition of success over the daughter they actually had. So I made my choice too. I stopped calling, I stopped sending letters. I stopped hoping that they would one day see me for who I really was, instead of mourning who they thought I should have been. I poured everything into my career, into my sailors, into the mission that gave my life meaning, even when the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had walked away. Years passed. I climbed the ranks steadily, taking on increasingly challenging assignments. I led naval operations in the Persian Gulf, commanded destroyers in the Pacific, and eventually found myself in charge of training programs for Special Operations Forces. My expertise in maritime strategy and counterterrorism had earned me a reputation throughout the Navy. Other officers sought my advice. Admirals requested me for their task forces. But success in the military is a lonely thing when you have no one to share it with. I'd learned to celebrate my victories alone, to process my challenges without the comfort of family support. I'd built a life of service and achievement, but it was a life lived in the shadows of the people who'd raised me, even though they'd chosen to turn their backs on the woman I'd become. 23 years after I'd walked out of my childhood home with nothing but determination and a duffel bag, my phone rang at 0600 hours. I was in my office at Naval Special Warfare Command, reviewing intelligence reports from our latest joint operation with SEAL Team 6. The caller ID showed my sister Emma's number. I hadn't heard from her in over 2 years. "Sarah?" Her voice was different now, older, with the weight of real responsibility instead of the carefree tone I remembered from her beauty queen days. "I'm calling about Dad." My father had suffered a massive heart attack 3 days earlier. He was stable, but the doctors said his active days were numbered. The family had decided to move forward with his retirement ceremony from the volunteer fire department, something they'd been planning for months. He'd served as chief for 15 years after leaving his insurance job, and the whole town was going to turn out to honor him. "That's good," I said carefully, setting down my classified briefing folder. "I'm glad he's okay." Emma's pause stretched long enough that I could hear her breathing through the phone. "Sarah, the ceremony is this Saturday at the VFW Hall, 2 o'clock. Mom wanted me to call because..." She trailed off, then started again. "Because she wanted you to know, but she also wanted me to tell you that it might be better if you didn't come." The words hit me like cold ocean water. After 23 years of silence, they were preemptively uninviting me to my own father's retirement celebration. Not because they were angry, but because they were embarrassed. Because they still couldn't figure out how to explain it to their friends. "I see," I said, my voice steady, despite the familiar ache in my chest. "And what do you think, Emma?" Another long pause. I think you've been gone so long that it might be awkward. For everyone. Dad's been telling people he has 2 kids, not 3. Jake's gonna give a speech about the family legacy, and you know how Mom gets when she's hosting events. She just wants everything to go smoothly. Dad had been telling people he had 2 kids. The man who taught me to ride a bike, who'd helped me with my math homework, who'd once been proud of my straight A's and my determination, had erased me from his life story completely. I'd become the daughter who never existed, the embarrassment they'd edited out of their family narrative. "I understand," I said. "Thank you for letting me know." "Sarah, it's not personal, it's just—" I hung up before she could finish explaining why my father's retirement party was no place for his actual daughter. I sat in my office for a long moment, looking at the framed photographs on my desk. Me with the Secretary of the Navy. Me with my sailors, after a successful mission in the Strait of Hormuz. Me receiving my latest commendation for excellence in special operations training. Pictures of a life they couldn't even comprehend, let alone celebrate. But something had shifted inside me during that phone call. For the first time in years, I wasn't willing to just accept their rejection quietly. My father was retiring, marking the end of an era of service that I understood better than anyone in that family. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, fine. But I wasn't going to pretend they didn't exist anymore. I cleared my schedule for Saturday and made arrangements to drive the 4 hours back to my hometown. I didn't call ahead. I didn't ask permission. I just decided that I was going to be there, not as the daughter begging for acceptance, but as the woman I'd become despite their abandonment. The drive gave me time to think about what I was walking into. My hometown hadn't changed much in the decades since I'd left. Same Main Street, same small-town politics. Same people who'd known me as the weird Mitchell girl who wanted to play soldier. They probably still saw me that way, if they remembered me at all. I checked into a small hotel on the outskirts of town Friday night, using my military ID for the government rate. The desk clerk, a young man maybe 25, looked at my ID with interest. "Navy?" he said. "My cousin's in the Navy. He's stationed in Norfolk." "Good for him," I said, taking my room key. "It's a good life if you're willing to work for it." That night, I lay in the generic hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, and thinking about all the times I'd imagined coming home. When I was a young ensign, I'd fantasized about walking into their living room in my dress whites, watching their faces change from disapproval to pride. When I was made lieutenant commander, I'd thought about calling to share the news, imagining my mother finally understanding that I hadn't ruined my life after all. But this wasn't about vindication anymore. This was about closure, about showing up for my father's moment of recognition, even if he couldn't show up for mine. About being the bigger person, even if it cost me whatever was left of my pride. Saturday morning, I dressed carefully, not in my uniform, which would have been too obvious, too confrontational. Instead, I chose a simple navy blue dress, professional but understated. I wanted to blend in, to observe, to be present without causing a scene. This was Dad's day, not mine. The VFW hall was exactly as I remembered it. American flags hanging from every possible surface, wood paneling that had been there since the 1970s, the smell of coffee and industrial carpet. I arrived early before the crowd gathered, and found a seat in the very back corner where I could see everything but remain relatively invisible. People began filtering in around 1:30. I recognized some faces, aged 23 years but still familiar. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store, now white-haired and moving with a cane. Coach Williams from the high school, retired and wearing a volunteer firefighter jacket. The mayor, who'd been mayor when I was in high school and apparently still held the position. Then I saw my family. Jake arrived first with his wife and 2 teenage sons I'd never met. He'd put on weight over the years, his quarterback physique softened by desk jobs and suburban comfort. He wore a suit that looked expensive, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to prove himself to anyone. Emma came next, accompanied by a husband I'd seen in Facebook photos but never met, and 3 young daughters dressed in matching pink dresses. She'd maintained her beauty queen appearance, blonde hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless even for a Saturday afternoon family event. She carried herself like someone accustomed to being admired, to being the center of attention. My mother entered like she owned the room, which in many ways she did. She'd organized this entire event, coordinated with the fire department, arranged the catering, sent the invitations. She wore a burgundy dress that was clearly new, bought specifically for this occasion, and she moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and compliments like she was hosting a state dinner. And then my father appeared, wearing his dress fire chief uniform with all his commendations and service pins. He looked older, frailer than I'd expected, but he carried himself with dignity. People gathered around him immediately, shaking his hand, slapping his back, sharing stories of his years of service to the community. I watched from my corner as my family took their places at the head table. There were 5 chairs, one for Dad, one for Mom, one for Jake and his wife, one for Emma and her husband. No chair for the daughter who'd served her country for over 2 decades. No acknowledgement that their family was anything other than the perfect unit they'd always wanted to project. The ceremony began with the Pledge of Allegiance. I stood with everyone else, my hand over my heart, the words as familiar to me as breathing. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt like an outsider in my own country, surrounded by people who claimed to honor service while systematically ignoring mine. The mayor gave opening remarks about community service and dedication. The current fire chief talked about my father's legacy of leadership and commitment. Jake stood up to give his speech about family values and the importance of following in your father's footsteps. Our dad taught us that service to others is the highest calling, Jake said, his voice carrying across the room. He showed us that being part of something bigger than yourself is what gives life meaning. Emma and I are so grateful to have learned those lessons from him. Emma and I. 2 children, not 3. The official family narrative, presented to a room full of witnesses. I sat in my corner, forgotten and invisible, listening to my brother talk about service, while the daughter, who'd actually dedicated her life to serving others, watched from the shadows like a stranger. The applause for Jake's speech died down, and I remained in my corner seat, hands folded in my lap, watching the ceremony unfold like a carefully choreographed performance. My father beamed at the head table, accepting handshakes and congratulations from a steady stream of community members. Fire department volunteers shared stories of his leadership during emergency calls, his calm under pressure, his dedication to training new recruits. I found myself studying his face, looking for traces of the man who used to help me with my homework at the kitchen table. The father who taught me to change a tire, who showed me how to read a compass, who once told me I could be anything I wanted to be if I worked hard enough. That man seemed like a ghost now, replaced by someone who found it easier to pretend I'd never existed than to explain why his daughter chose a path he couldn't understand. Mrs. Henderson, the fire department auxiliary president, took the podium to present my father with a plaque commemorating his years of service. She spoke about his sacrifice, his commitment to protecting the community, his willingness to put others before himself. All qualities I recognized, all values that had shaped my own sense of duty and service. The irony wasn't lost on me, that I was sitting in a room full of people celebrating those exact principles while being systematically excluded from the family that had supposedly instilled them. A photographer moved through the crowd, capturing moments for the local newspaper. He took pictures of my father with the current fire chief, with the mayor, with longtime department members. Then he gathered the family for formal portraits. My mother straightened her dress and checked her lipstick. Jake and Emma positioned themselves on either side of Dad, their spouses and children arranged around them like ornaments on a perfectly decorated tree. The photographer called out directions. "Mr. Mitchell, could you put your arm around your son?" "Mrs. Mitchell, beautiful smile, kids look this way," click, click, click. The official record of a retirement celebration, a family moment captured for posterity. Future generations would look at these photos and see a complete family, never knowing that a 3rd child had been deliberately cropped out of the frame. I watched my mother during the photo session, the way she tilted her head just so, the practiced smile she'd perfected over decades of community events. She'd always been good at presenting the right image, at making sure everything looked perfect from the outside. My decision to join the military hadn't just disappointed her. It had disrupted her carefully curated vision of what our family was supposed to be. The ceremony continued with presentations from various community organizations. The Rotary Club gave Dad a certificate of appreciation. The Chamber of Commerce presented him with an honorary membership. Each speaker emphasized the same themes: service, dedication, family values, community spirit, words that should have included me but somehow never did. During a lull in the presentations, I noticed conversations happening at nearby tables. People were catching up on local news, sharing updates about their children's accomplishments, their grandchildren's achievements. I overheard Mrs. Patterson telling someone about her grandson's college graduation, his new job at a law firm in the state capital. At another table, Coach Williams was bragging about his daughter's promotion to principal at the elementary school. These were the kinds of conversations my parents had been having for years, I realized. Updates about Jake's insurance business, Emma's husband's dental practice, their children's academic and athletic achievements. Simple, understandable accomplishments that fit neatly into small-town expectations. How do you explain to these people that your other daughter commands naval operations? How do you casually mention that she's responsible for training the most elite fighting forces in the world? You don't. You just pretend she doesn't exist. The crowd began to thin slightly as the formal presentations concluded, and people moved toward the refreshment tables. I remained seated, observing the social dynamics, the easy familiarity between my family and their friends. They belonged here in a way I never had, even as a child. They understood the unspoken rules, the social expectations, the comfortable rhythms of small-town life. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down to see it was from Commander Torres, my executive officer at Naval Special Warfare Command. Admiral Peterson wants to meet with you Tuesday about the joint training exercise. Sounds like you impressed someone important during the briefing. Admiral Peterson, one of the most respected leaders in the Navy, someone whose opinion could shape the trajectory of my entire career. He wanted to meet with me because of my strategic recommendations for improving special operations readiness. In my world, this was significant news, the kind of development that could lead to new opportunities, greater responsibilities, higher rank. But in this room, surrounded by people who measured success by different standards, it meant nothing. I put my phone away and continued watching my family navigate their social obligations with practiced ease. Emma was working the room now, moving from table to table with her daughters in tow, accepting compliments on how well-behaved they were, how pretty they looked in their matching dresses. She'd mastered the art of gracious conversation, of making everyone feel important while maintaining her position as the family's shining star. She asked about grandchildren, remembered details about people's health problems, complimented the women on their outfits and the men on their service to the community. Jake was holding court near the head table, surrounded by other middle-aged men discussing business, local politics, and sports. He'd inherited my father's easy charisma, his ability to make people feel comfortable and heard. He was telling a story about a difficult insurance claim, gesturing with his hands, making the group laugh at just the right moments. These were his people, and he was clearly in his element. My mother was supervising the refreshment service with military precision, ensuring the coffee stayed hot, the cookies remained attractively arranged, and the volunteer servers knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing. She'd always been good at managing events, at making sure every detail was perfect. I could see where I'd inherited some of my organizational skills, my attention to operational planning, though she'd probably be horrified to know she'd contributed to my military success in any way. An older man I didn't recognize approached my father with what appeared to be a framed photograph. They shook hands warmly, and the man presented the gift with an obvious ceremony. Dad unwrapped it carefully, revealing what looked like a vintage fire department photo, probably from the early days of his service. Other people gathered around to see, pointing at faces in the picture, sharing memories of colleagues who'd retired or passed away. This was the kind of gesture my father appreciated, I realized. Tangible recognition from people who understood his world, who shared his values, who could appreciate his contribution in terms he could relate to. My commendations and promotions existed in a realm so foreign to his experience that they might as well have been written in a different language. A woman at a nearby table was talking loudly enough for me to overhear her conversation with her companion. "Chief Mitchell has done so much for this community," she was saying. "And what wonderful children he has. Jake's insurance agency has been such a blessing to local families. And Emma volunteers at the school library every week. They really raised their kids right." 2 children. Even the community members had absorbed the narrative. In their minds, my parents had produced exactly the offspring they'd hoped for. A successful businessman who stayed local and contributed to the community, and a devoted mother who balanced family life with volunteer service. Clean, simple, understandable achievements that everyone could appreciate and respect. I shifted in my chair and accidentally caught the eye of Mrs. Davidson, my old high school English teacher. She squinted at me for a moment, clearly trying to place my face. I could see the recognition dawning slowly, followed by confusion. She whispered something to the woman next to her, who turned to look at me with obvious curiosity. The whispers started spreading outward from their table like ripples in a pond. People were beginning to realize that someone was there who didn't quite belong. Someone whose presence required explanation. I could see heads turning, conversations pausing, sideways glances in my direction. My heart rate increased slightly, but I remained calm, composed, and professional. This was the moment I'd been preparing for without realizing it. The moment when my quiet observation would transition into something more complicated, more charged with possibility and risk. The whispers grew louder as more people began to notice me sitting alone in the back corner. I could see the recognition spreading through the room like a slow-moving wave. Mrs. Davidson was now engaged in animated conversation with 3 other women, all of them stealing glances in my direction. Someone pulled out their phone, probably checking Facebook or calling a friend to confirm what they thought they were seeing. I maintained my composure, sitting straight-backed with my hands folded, watching the ceremony continue even as the undercurrent of curiosity about my presence grew stronger. My father was still accepting congratulations at the front of the room, completely unaware that his carefully orchestrated event was developing an unexpected subplot. Then I saw him, a man in dress blues moving through the crowd with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command. Navy uniform, rows of ribbons on his chest, silver oak leaves on his collar. Captain's rank. He was scanning the room methodically, clearly looking for someone specific. When his eyes found mine, he paused, studied my face for a moment, then began walking directly toward me. Captain James Rodriguez. I recognized him immediately, though we'd never served together directly. His reputation in naval special warfare was legendary. He'd commanded SEAL teams in Afghanistan, led joint operations in the South China Sea, and was currently stationed at Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek. What was he doing at a small-town fire chief's retirement ceremony? As he approached my table, conversations around us began to fade. People sensed that something significant was happening, though they couldn't understand what. Captain Rodriguez stopped directly in front of me, his bearing formal and respectful. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet section of the room. "Are you Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell?" The question hung in the air like a dropped bomb. Lieutenant Commander, military rank. Suddenly, the woman sitting alone in the back corner wasn't just some random attendee or distant relative. I was someone with a title, someone whose presence required explanation. "I am," I replied calmly, not standing, not making any gesture that would draw additional attention. "Captain Rodriguez, Naval Special Warfare Command," he said, extending his hand. "I've heard exceptional things about your work with SEAL training protocols. Your innovations in maritime assault tactics have been implemented across multiple teams." I shook his hand briefly, aware that every word of our conversation was being absorbed by the people around us. "Thank you, Captain. I wasn't expecting to see Navy personnel here today. My nephew is getting married next weekend in the area, so I'm visiting family," he explained. "I saw the local paper this morning, noticed the retirement ceremony for Chief Mitchell, and thought I'd pay my respects. When I arrived and saw you, I had to introduce myself. Your reputation precedes you, Commander." The formal military courtesy, the respectful tone, the obvious admiration in his voice. None of it was lost on the audience that had formed around us. People were straining to hear every word, trying to piece together who I was and why a Navy captain was treating me with such deference. "That's very kind," I said. "Are you familiar with Chief Mitchell's work with the volunteer fire department?" "Not personally, but community service deserves recognition regardless of the uniform," Captain Rodriguez replied. "Speaking of which, I understand you're being considered for promotion to full commander. The Navy needs more officers with your strategic vision." Promotion to commander. The words rippled through the crowd like electricity. People were pulling out their phones now, some clearly Googling my name, others texting furiously to friends and family members. The woman sitting in the back corner wasn't just Lieutenant Commander Mitchell anymore. She was someone important enough to warrant a personal visit from a captain, someone whose career advancement was significant enough to discuss at a social gathering. "Nothing's official yet," I said diplomatically. "Well, when it is, the teams will be lucky to have you in a senior position," he said. "Your counterterrorism protocols have saved lives, Commander. That matters more than any ceremony or celebration." He shook my hand again, nodded respectfully, and moved toward the front of the room to introduce himself to my father. I remained seated, but I could feel the energy in the room shifting dramatically. Conversations had stopped entirely in my section. People were staring openly now, no longer pretending to be subtle about their curiosity. Mrs. Davidson approached my table first, her face flushed with excitement and confusion. Behind her came Coach Williams and several other people I recognized from my childhood. "Sarah Mitchell," Mrs. Davidson said, shaking her head in amazement. "I thought that was you, but I couldn't believe it. Lieutenant Commander? In the Navy?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied simply. "But why didn't anyone tell us?" she asked, looking genuinely bewildered. "I mean, we've known your family for decades. Your mother never mentioned." She trailed off, realizing that she was about to say something potentially embarrassing about my family's failure to acknowledge my military service. The implications were sinking in for everyone within earshot. If I was a lieutenant commander, if Navy captains were seeking me out to pay their respects, if I was being considered for promotion, then I wasn't just some black sheep who disappeared from town. I was someone who'd achieved significant success in a world they barely understood. Coach Williams stepped forward, extending his hand. "Sarah, I remember when you used to run laps around the track after school, always pushing yourself harder than anyone else. Guess that paid off." "It taught me discipline," I said, shaking his hand. "Thank you for remembering." More people were gathering now, drawn by curiosity and the growing realization that they were witnessing something unexpected. Word was spreading through the room that Chief Mitchell's missing daughter was not only present but apparently some kind of high-ranking military officer. I could see my family at the front of the room beginning to notice the commotion. Emma was craning her neck, trying to see what was causing the disturbance. Jake was frowning, clearly annoyed that attention was being diverted from Dad's ceremony. My mother was watching with growing alarm, probably recognizing that whatever was happening involved me and was therefore a threat to her carefully planned event. Captain Rodriguez had reached my father and was introducing himself. I watched Dad's face change as he realized he was speaking to a Navy captain. His posture straightened. His demeanor became more formal. He was clearly flattered by the attention, pleased that a high-ranking military officer had come to honor his retirement. "Chief Mitchell," I heard Captain Rodriguez say, his voice carrying across the now quiet room, "thank you for your years of service to this community. As a fellow service member, I understand the dedication required to put others before yourself." My father beamed, shaking the captain's hand enthusiastically. "Thank you for coming, Captain. It means a lot to have someone of your caliber here today." "Actually," Captain Rodriguez said, glancing in my direction, "I was hoping to meet your daughter as well. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell has quite a reputation in naval special warfare circles." The color drained from my father's face. For a moment, he looked genuinely confused, as if the captain was speaking about someone he didn't know. Then understanding dawned, and I watched 23 years of denial crumble in real time. "Sarah?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir," Captain Rodriguez confirmed. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, one of the finest officers I've had the privilege of working with, even indirectly." You must be incredibly proud. My father's eyes found mine across the crowded room. For the first time in over 2 decades, we looked directly at each other. His expression was a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been recognition. Not just recognition of my face, but recognition of what my presence here in this moment, with this witness, actually meant. The room had gone completely silent now. Everyone was watching this exchange, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, something that would be discussed and analyzed for years to come. My mother was standing frozen beside Dad, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the pallor that had crept across her face. Captain Rodriguez looked back and forth between my father and me, clearly beginning to understand that the family dynamics were more complicated than he'd anticipated. But he was too professional, too experienced, to retreat from the situation he'd inadvertently created. "Chief Mitchell," he said carefully, "I hope I'm not overstepping, but your daughter's work in developing training protocols for high-risk maritime operations has been revolutionary. The Navy is fortunate to have officers of her caliber." My father stood frozen at the front of the room, Captain Rodriguez's words hanging in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. The silence stretched so long I could hear the ancient heating system cycling on, the distant sound of traffic from the main road, someone's coffee cup clinking against a saucer. Every person in that VFW hall was holding their breath, waiting to see how Chief Mitchell would respond to learning that his disowned daughter was apparently a decorated naval officer. "Lieutenant Commander," my father repeated slowly, as if testing the words in his mouth. His eyes remained locked on mine across the room, and I could see him trying to reconcile the awkward 18-year-old who'd left home with a duffel bag with the woman Captain Rodriguez was describing. My daughter Sarah is a lieutenant commander." It wasn't a question. It was a man processing information that didn't fit into any framework he'd constructed over the past 23 years. Captain Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically, apparently still unaware of the family dynamics he'd just exposed. "One of the most promising officers in her field," the captain continued. "I was just telling her that her promotion to full commander seems inevitable. The work she's done developing protocols for SEAL Team maritime infiltration has been adopted throughout the special operations community." SEAL Team protocols. Maritime infiltration. The words meant nothing to most people in that room, but they carried weight, implied expertise, suggested a level of responsibility and trust that couldn't be faked or exaggerated. My mother's hand went to her throat, a gesture I remembered from childhood whenever she was overwhelmed by social situations she couldn't control. Jake was the first family member to move. I watched him excuse himself from his conversation and walk toward the back of the room, his expression a mixture of curiosity and something that looked almost like suspicion. He'd always been protective of the family's image, quick to shut down anything that might complicate their carefully maintained narrative. "Sarah?" he said as he approached my table, his voice carrying a forced casualness that didn't match the tension in his shoulders. "I didn't realize you were here." "Hello, Jake," I replied calmly. "Congratulations on your speech earlier. Very well done." He looked around at the crowd that had gathered near my table, clearly uncomfortable with the attention I was drawing. "Maybe we should talk privately," he suggested, the implication clear that he wanted to remove me from the public eye before I could cause any more disruption. But Mrs. Davidson was having none of it. She'd taught English for 40 years and had developed an instinct for significant moments that shouldn't be swept under the rug. "Jake Mitchell," she said sharply, "did you know your sister was a lieutenant commander in the Navy?" Jake's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how to answer without admitting that the family had spent over 2 decades pretending I didn't exist. Captain Rodriguez was watching this exchange with growing understanding, his professional demeanor masking what was clearly dawning recognition of the family situation. The military is," Jake stammered, then stopped, apparently realizing that any explanation would only make things worse. Coach Williams stepped into the silence. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," he said formally, "I think the whole community owes you an apology. We had no idea you were serving our country with such distinction." The word distinction seemed to snap my father out of his trance. He began walking toward us, moving slowly through the crowd that parted to let him pass. People were whispering now, not trying to hide their conversations anymore. I caught fragments of comments floating through the air. 23 years and they never mentioned. A lieutenant commander, can you imagine? Those SEAL teams? That's serious business. How do you just not talk about something like that? My father reached our group and stopped directly in front of me. Up close, I could see how much he'd aged, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered, his hair completely gray now. But his posture was still straight, still carrying the bearing of someone accustomed to command, even if his command had been limited to volunteer firefighters rather than naval operations. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice barely audible despite the silence around us, "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell." "Dad," I replied, matching his formal tone. Captain Rodriguez, perhaps sensing that he'd stepped into something deeply personal, began to excuse himself. "I should let you have your family time," he said diplomatically. "Commander Mitchell, it's been an honor." "Wait," my father said suddenly, his voice gaining strength. "Captain Rodriguez, please. I'd like to hear more about my daughter's service." The request surprised everyone, including me. For over 2 decades, my father had shown no interest in my military career, had actively avoided acknowledging it existed. Now he was asking a Navy captain to brief him on my accomplishments in front of half the town. Captain Rodriguez glanced at me, clearly asking permission. I nodded slightly, curious to see where this would lead. "Well, Chief Mitchell," the captain began, "your daughter has become something of a legend in special operations training circles. Her strategic innovations in underwater approach tactics have revolutionized how we prepare SEAL teams for high-risk missions. She's also developed psychological evaluation protocols that have significantly improved team performance under extreme stress." Each word hit the crowd like a small explosion. Underwater tactics, SEAL teams, high-risk missions. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were specific, dangerous, important responsibilities that belonged to the quiet woman who'd been sitting unnoticed in the back corner. "She's currently overseeing the training of some of our most elite units," Captain Rodriguez continued. "The kind of work that requires absolute trust from the highest levels of command. Lieutenant commanders don't get those assignments unless they've proven themselves exceptional." My mother had finally moved from her position near the head table and was approaching our group with careful, measured steps. Her face was pale but composed, her social training taking over even in crisis. She'd spent decades managing difficult situations at community events. This was just another challenge to navigate with grace and dignity. "Captain Rodriguez," she said smoothly, extending her hand with practiced charm, "I'm Patricia Mitchell, Sarah's mother. Thank you so much for coming to honor my husband's retirement." The words, "Sarah's mother," came out without hesitation, as if she'd been claiming me proudly for years instead of pretending I didn't exist. Captain Rodriguez shook her hand politely, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was beginning to understand that something very complicated was happening here. "Mrs. Mitchell," he replied carefully, "you must be incredibly proud of your daughter's achievements." The question hung in the air like a challenge. How do you answer that when you've spent 23 years refusing to acknowledge those achievements existed? My mother's social skills were considerable, but this situation was beyond even her ability to smooth over with pleasant conversation. "Of course we are," she said finally, her voice steady despite the obvious strain. "Sarah has always been determined." Determined. It was such a carefully neutral word, acknowledging my persistence without admitting pride, recognizing my success without celebrating it. Classic diplomatic language from a woman who'd mastered the art of saying nothing while appearing to say everything. Emma had joined us now, bringing her entire family with her. Her husband looked confused, clearly trying to piece together why his wife's sister was suddenly the center of attention at what was supposed to be a routine retirement ceremony. Their 3 daughters stood behind them, staring at me with the wide-eyed curiosity of children witnessing adult drama they couldn't quite understand. "Aunt Sarah?" the oldest girl asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Are you really in the Navy?" It was the first time any of my nieces had spoken to me directly. I wasn't sure they'd even known I existed before this moment. I looked down at her serious face, saw genuine curiosity rather than judgment, and felt something loosen in my chest. Yes, I said simply. I am. Do you drive boats? She asked, apparently unaware that she was asking questions her parents couldn't answer. Sometimes, I replied, and I help train the people who do the really important boat driving. Captain Rodriguez smiled at the exchange. Your aunt helps train some of the bravest sailors in the world, he told the girl, the kind of people who keep our country safe. The simple explanation seemed to satisfy her, but it had a profound effect on the adults around us. Suddenly, my career wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't some incomprehensible military thing that existed in a world they couldn't relate to. It was about keeping people safe, about service, about the same values my father had spent his life trying to instill in the community. The crowd around us had grown to include nearly half the people in the hall. Word was spreading rapidly through whispered conversations and urgent text messages. I could see people in the back, pulling up Google searches on their phones, probably trying to verify what they were hearing. The retirement ceremony had transformed into something entirely different, something no one had planned for. Mayor Thompson pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with the excitement of someone who sensed a significant moment unfolding. He'd always been good at inserting himself into situations that might reflect well on the town, and this was clearly no exception. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, on behalf of the entire community, I want to thank you for your service to our nation. We had no idea we had such a distinguished military officer with local ties. Local ties. As if my connection to this place was something distant and tenuous rather than the fact that I'd grown up here, graduated from the local high school, and had my heart broken in this very building when I realized my own family would rather pretend I didn't exist than acknowledge what I'd accomplished. Thank you, Mayor, I replied diplomatically. It's been an honor to serve. I'm sure the whole town would love to hear about your experiences, he continued, his political instincts fully engaged. Perhaps you'd consider speaking at our Memorial Day ceremony this year? We always like to honor local veterans. The invitation hung in the air, creating another moment of tension. My parents had never mentioned my military service to their friends and neighbors. How would they explain suddenly featuring their estranged daughter as a guest speaker at the most important patriotic event of the year? Before I could respond, Captain Rodriguez's phone buzzed with what was clearly an urgent message. He glanced at it, frowned, and looked back at me with sudden intensity. Commander Mitchell, he said quietly, I need to speak with you privately for a moment. The formal tone and the way he'd shifted from casual conversation to official business caught everyone's attention. He stepped slightly away from the crowd, and I followed, aware that every eye in the room was tracking our movement. I just received word from Naval Special Warfare Command, he said in a low voice that only I could hear. Admiral Peterson wants to speak with you immediately. There's been a development with the joint training exercise we discussed. Admiral Peterson, the same admiral my executive officer had mentioned in his text message. If he was calling on a Saturday afternoon, pulling me away from personal time, it meant something significant was happening. How soon? I asked. He's en route to Little Creek now. He wants you there for a briefing at 1,900 hours, Captain Rodriguez checked his watch. That gives you about 4 hours to get there. 4 hours to drive from my hometown to Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek. It was doable, but it would mean leaving now, cutting short whatever this confrontation with my family was going to become. Part of me was relieved at the prospect of escape, but another part recognized that walking away now would just perpetuate the same patterns that had defined our relationship for over 2 decades. Is this about the maritime infiltration protocols? I asked. I suspect so, but Admiral Peterson doesn't share details over unsecured communications, Captain Rodriguez replied. What I can tell you is that when he wants to see someone on a Saturday night, it's because something important is happening. I nodded, processing the implications. Admiral Peterson wasn't just any flag officer. He was one of the architects of modern special operations doctrine. If he wanted to meet with me personally, it likely meant my recommendations for improving SEAL team training had caught the attention of people at the highest levels of naval special warfare. Understood, I said. I'll need to leave within the hour. Captain Rodriguez nodded and stepped back toward the crowd, but our conversation hadn't gone unnoticed. My father was watching us intently, clearly trying to read the situation from our body language and expressions. "Is everything all right?" he asked as we rejoined the group. "Just military business," I replied neutrally. "On a Saturday?" my mother asked, her social antenna picking up on the tension. Captain Rodriguez answered before I could. "The Navy doesn't observe regular business hours when national security is involved, ma'am. Your daughter is being called to a briefing with senior command." Senior command. The words rippled through the crowd like stones dropped in still water. Whatever was happening wasn't routine. It was important enough to interrupt personal time, significant enough to require immediate attention from someone at my level. Jake was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not admiration exactly, but something closer to bewilderment. His little sister, the family disappointment, was apparently important enough that Navy admirals wanted to brief her on Saturday nights. "What kind of briefing?" he asked. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I looked at him steadily, weighing how much to reveal. "The kind I can't discuss with civilians," I said simply. The word civilians created another moment of silence. It was a gentle but unmistakable reminder that I operated in a world they had no access to, that my responsibilities extended far beyond anything they could understand or evaluate. They were civilians. I was in the military. We lived in fundamentally different universes. Emma was gripping her husband's arm, her face pale. I could see her trying to process everything that had happened in the past 30 minutes. Her little sister, the weird kid who used to do push-ups in her bedroom, was apparently trusted with classified information by senior military officials. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" she asked quietly. 23 years, I replied, "since the day I left for basic training." The timeline hit them like a physical blow. 23 years of service they'd never acknowledged, never celebrated, never even asked about. 2 decades of increasing responsibility and recognition that they'd simply ignored because it didn't fit their vision of what their daughter should be. Mrs. Davidson was shaking her head in amazement. "Sarah, honey, we've all been reading about these special operations in the news, these incredible missions. To think you've been part of that world. I help prepare the people who execute those missions." The words weren't spoken with anger or bitterness, just simple truth. I wasn't being cruel. I was being accurate. They'd had countless opportunities to bridge the gap between us, and they'd chosen not to take them. "We didn't understand," my mother said suddenly. "We didn't know how important. We thought you were just playing soldier." Playing soldier. Even now, even with a Navy captain standing right there explaining my role in training elite special operations forces, she still couldn't quite grasp that what I did was real, serious, vital work. "I know you didn't understand," I said gently. "That was always the problem." Captain Rodriguez was gathering his things, preparing to escort me out. The crowd was beginning to realize that this unexpected drama was coming to an end, that the mysterious daughter was about to disappear as suddenly as she'd been revealed. "Commander," he said formally, "shall we head out? I can give you directions to Little Creek if you're not familiar with the route." I nodded and turned back to my family one last time. 23 years of silence, and now I had maybe 60 seconds to sum up everything that had gone wrong between us. "Dad," I said quietly, "congratulations on your retirement. You served your community well, and that matters. But I've been serving too, just in ways you never bothered to learn about." The truth hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. I gathered my purse and prepared to leave, but the crowd wasn't ready to let me go. People were pressing closer, asking questions, requesting selfies, treating me like some kind of celebrity who'd been discovered in their midst. Mrs. Patterson grabbed my arm gently but insistently. "Sarah dear, before you go, could you just tell us a little about what you do? We're all so curious, and we feel terrible that we didn't know." The request was innocent enough, but it put me in an impossible position. How do you explain classified military operations to a room full of civilians? How do you describe the weight of responsibility for training people who might die if you make the wrong decision? How do you make them understand that your work isn't about glory or recognition, but about preparing warriors for missions that most people can't even imagine? I develop training protocols for special operations forces, I said carefully. I help make sure our sailors are as prepared as possible for dangerous assignments. Like the Navy SEALs? Asked Coach Williams, clearly impressed by his own knowledge of military terminology. Among others, I replied neutrally. But my attempt at discretion only seemed to fuel their curiosity. Someone in the back called out, "Have you ever been in combat?" Another voice asked, "Do you know any famous SEALs?" A third person wanted to know if I'd been involved in any of the operations they'd seen in movies. Captain Rodriguez stepped in smoothly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you understand that operational details can't be discussed in public settings. Commander Mitchell's work involves sensitive national security matters." National security. The phrase created another ripple of excitement through the crowd. They weren't just talking to someone who worked for the military. They were talking to someone who dealt with secrets, someone whose decisions affected the safety of the country. My phone buzzed with another text message. This time it was from Admiral Peterson himself. "Rodriguez briefed me on your situation. Take the time you need, but I want to see you tonight. This is about more than training protocols." More than training protocols. That could mean anything from a new assignment, to a promotion, to involvement in an active operation. Admiral Peterson wasn't known for dramatic language. If he said it was important, it was important. Jake was studying my face as I read the message. "Is that your boss?" he asked. "One of them," I said, putting the phone away. "How many bosses do you have?" Emma asked, clearly trying to understand the hierarchy of my professional life. "It's complicated," I replied. "The military has a very structured chain of command. Admiral Peterson is several levels above me, but when he calls, you answer." "An admiral," my father repeated slowly. "An admiral wants to meet with you personally." The weight of that was finally starting to sink in for all of them. Admirals don't call lieutenant commanders on Saturday afternoons unless something significant is happening. They were beginning to understand that my career wasn't just respectable or successful, it was extraordinary. My mother was wringing her hands, her composure finally cracking. "Sarah, we need to explain. We need you to understand why things happened the way they did." "Mom," I said gently but firmly, "I understood a long time ago. You wanted daughters who fit your vision of what daughters should be. I didn't fit that vision, so you decided it was easier to pretend I didn't exist than to expand your definition of success." The brutal honesty of the statement silenced the entire room. People looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with witnessing such a raw family moment. But it needed to be said, and it needed to be heard by everyone who'd spent years accepting my family's narrative about their two children. Captain Rodriguez was checking his watch meaningfully. "Commander, we really should discuss that route to Little Creek." I nodded and began moving toward the exit, but my father stepped into my path. For a moment, we stood face to face, father and daughter, two people who'd once been close but had become strangers through years of willful blindness and stubborn pride. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I don't know how to fix this." "You can't fix 23 years in one conversation, Dad," I replied. "But you could try acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, the daughter you wrote off actually turned out okay." His eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I saw the man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd helped me with science fair projects, who'd once believed I could do anything I set my mind to. But that man had disappeared when I chose a path he couldn't understand. "More than okay," he whispered. "You turned out incredible." The admission hung between us, too little and too late, but genuine nonetheless. Around us, people were listening to every word, witnessing the collapse of a family myth that had been maintained for over 2 decades. Emma was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks despite her waterproof makeup claims. "Sarah, I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "We were so wrong. We were so incredibly wrong." But apologies, no matter how sincere, couldn't undo the damage of years of deliberate exclusion. They couldn't give me back the holidays I'd spent alone, the promotions I'd celebrated in solitude, the moments when I'd needed family support and found only silence. "I know you're sorry," I said simply, "but sorry doesn't change the fact that you chose not to know me for 23 years. You chose not to care what happened to me, as long as it didn't interfere with your perfect family image." Captain Rodriguez was standing by the door now, clearly ready to leave. The crowd was beginning to disperse slightly, people drifting back to their tables, but still straining to hear our conversation. The retirement ceremony had been completely forgotten. All attention was focused on this unexpected family drama. "Will you call us?" my mother asked desperately. "Will you let us try to be better?" I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who'd raised me and then systematically erased me from her life. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile, but also smaller somehow. The authority she'd wielded over my childhood had evaporated, replaced by the desperate hope of someone who'd finally realized what she'd lost. "I'll think about it," I said finally. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a rejection either. Jake stepped forward, extending his hand formally. "Sarah, I want you to know what you've accomplished. It's amazing. I wish I'd known. I wish we'd all known." I shook his hand briefly. "You could have known, Jake. You all could have known. You just had to ask." The simple truth of it seemed to hit him like a physical blow. They hadn't been excluded from my life. They'd excluded themselves through their own prejudice and narrow-mindedness. "Commander," Captain Rodriguez said from the doorway, "we really do need to depart." I nodded and turned to address the room one final time. "Thank you all for honoring my father's service today. Community service matters, regardless of the uniform you wear or the organization you serve." Then I walked toward the exit, Captain Rodriguez falling into step beside me. Behind us, I could hear the low murmur of dozens of conversations breaking out simultaneously as people processed what they'd just witnessed. As we reached the door, I heard my father call out one last time, "Sarah, I'm proud of you. I should have said it years ago, but I'm proud of you." I paused at the threshold and looked back at him. "Thank you, Dad. That means something." And it did mean something, even though it came 23 years too late. The parking lot of the VFW hall was quiet compared to the chaos I'd just left behind. Captain Rodriguez walked beside me toward the small rental car I'd driven from the hotel, his expression thoughtful. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower, casting long shadows across the asphalt and reminding me that I had a tight timeline to make it to Little Creek. "That was quite a situation in there," he said diplomatically as we reached my car. 23 years in the making," I replied, pulling my keys from my purse. "Thank you for handling it professionally. You could have just walked away when you realized what you'd stepped into." He shook his head. "Commander, what I witnessed in there was a family finally learning what the rest of us in the military have known for years. You're one of the finest officers I've had the privilege of encountering, and they needed to hear that from someone who understands what you do." I unlocked the car door but didn't get in immediately. Through the windows of the VFW hall, I could see people still gathered in animated conversation. No doubt they were dissecting every moment of what had just occurred, trying to piece together the story of the Mitchell family's missing daughter who'd returned as a decorated naval officer. "Captain, can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course. How did you find me here? I mean, what made you think to look for me at a retirement ceremony in a small town in Virginia?" Rodriguez smiled slightly. "I didn't come looking for you specifically. I really am here visiting family for my nephew's wedding. But when I saw the newspaper mention of Chief Mitchell's retirement ceremony, I did some basic research. Mitchell isn't a common name around here, and when I realized there was a Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell in Naval Special Warfare, I thought it might be worth checking if there was a family connection." "So you Googled me?" "I Googled you," he confirmed. "What I found was impressive. Your innovations in maritime infiltration training have been implemented by every SEAL team on the East Coast. Your psychological evaluation protocols have reduced training failures by 30%. You've literally saved lives and made our special operations forces more effective." The praise was gratifying, but it also highlighted the absurdity of what had just happened inside. While my family had spent over 2 decades treating my career as an embarrassment, the actual military had been recognizing and implementing my work at the highest levels. "The irony isn't lost on me," I said. "What irony?" "My family's been telling people they have 2 children for years. Meanwhile, admirals are calling me on Saturday afternoons." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, clearly processing the implications of what he'd witnessed. "Commander, I hope I didn't make things worse by speaking up there. I just couldn't stand by and watch people undervalue someone of your caliber." "You didn't make anything worse," I assured him. You just accelerated a conversation that was probably inevitable. They couldn't keep pretending I didn't exist forever. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. I hesitated, then answered. This is Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. Commander Mitchell, this is reporter Susan Chen from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. I'm calling about the incident at the retirement ceremony this afternoon. We understand there was some kind of family revelation involving a high-ranking military officer. I closed my eyes, realizing that the story was already starting to spread beyond the confines of the VFW hall. Someone had called the media, probably thinking they were doing me a favor by publicizing my military service. But media attention was the last thing I needed, especially with a classified briefing scheduled for tonight. I have no comment, I said simply. Commander, we're planning to run a story about local military heroes. Wouldn't you like the opportunity to share your perspective on your service and your family's reaction to learning about your achievements? No comment, I repeated and hung up. Rodriguez was watching me with concern. Media? Local newspaper. Someone must have called them from inside. I gestured toward the VFW hall, where I could see people still clustered in intense conversation near the windows. That's going to complicate things, he said. It's going to complicate things for my family more than for me, I replied. I'm used to operating in classified environments. They're not used to having their family drama become public knowledge. As if to prove my point, my phone immediately rang again. This time it was Emma calling. Sarah, please don't hang up, she said before I could even say hello. There are reporters calling the house. Mom is freaking out. Can you please come back and help us handle this? The request was so absurd, I almost laughed. After 23 years of refusing to acknowledge my existence, they wanted me to come back and manage their media crisis for them. Emma, I have a briefing with an Admiral in 3 hours. I can't come back and hold your hand through a situation you created. We didn't create this, she protested. You created this the day you decided it was easier to pretend I didn't exist than to learn about what I actually do for a living, I said firmly. The reporters are calling because they found out your family has been hiding a decorated military officer for over 2 decades. That's newsworthy precisely because it's so unusual for a family to completely disown someone who's achieved what I've achieved. What should we tell them? Tell them the truth, I said. Tell them you made a mistake 23 years ago, and you're trying to figure out how to fix it now. I ended the call and looked at Captain Rodriguez, who was trying not to smile. Family dynamics, he said diplomatically. Family dynamics, I agreed. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. Please help us. We don't know what to do. I showed the message to Rodriguez. Any advice, Captain? Well, Commander, in my experience, the best way to handle a crisis is to take responsibility for your actions and focus on moving forward rather than managing perceptions. That's very wise advice. I'm not sure they're ready to hear it. Another text came through, this one from Jake. Can you at least give us talking points? We don't want to say the wrong thing. I typed back quickly. Don't lie, don't make excuses. Don't blame me for your choices. Beyond that, you're on your own. Captain Rodriguez checked his watch. Commander, if you're going to make it to Little Creek by 1900, you really need to get on the road. I nodded and opened the car door. As I did, I saw my father emerging from the VFW hall, walking quickly toward the parking lot. His face was flushed, and he looked around frantically until he spotted me. Sarah, he called out, jogging toward us despite his age. Please, just one more minute. I paused with one foot in the car, waiting to see what final words he wanted to share. I know you have to go, he said, breathing hard from his short run. But I need you to know something. When Captain Rodriguez was telling everyone about your work, about the SEAL teams and the protocols, and the Admiral wanting to see you, I felt something I haven't felt in 23 years. What was that, Dad? Pride, he said simply. Pure, overwhelming pride in my daughter. And shame. Terrible shame that I let my own narrow thinking cost me the chance to watch you become the incredible woman you are. The admission was more than I'd expected, more honest than any conversation we'd had since I was 18. Rodriguez stepped back slightly, giving us privacy for this moment. Dad, I appreciate that. I really do. But pride expressed after the fact doesn't change the years when I needed your support and didn't have it. I know, he said, but maybe it's a start. Maybe it's the beginning of me finally being the father you deserved all along. I looked at this man who'd helped shape me and then rejected me, who'd taught me values and then failed to recognize them when I lived them out in ways he hadn't anticipated. Maybe, I said, but that's going to have to be a conversation for another day. Right now, an Admiral is waiting. I drove away from the VFW hall with my father standing in the parking lot, watching my rental car disappear down the main street of my hometown. In my rearview mirror, I could see him still standing there, a solitary figure processing 23 years of regret in the fading afternoon light. The drive to Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek gave me time to decompress from the emotional chaos of the last few hours. My phone continued buzzing with calls and text messages, but I ignored them all. Local reporters, family members, even some high school classmates who'd apparently heard about the incident through social media. The story was spreading faster than I'd anticipated. As I merged onto Interstate 64, heading east toward the coast, I found myself thinking about the look on my mother's face when Captain Rodriguez had explained my role in training SEAL teams. Pure shock, followed by something that might have been recognition. Not recognition of my face, but recognition that the daughter she'd dismissed might actually be someone worth knowing. The irony was almost overwhelming. For years, I'd fantasized about moments like this. Coming home successful, accomplished, undeniably important. Showing them that their rejection had been based on ignorance rather than insight. But now that it had actually happened, I felt strangely empty. The vindication I'd imagined would be satisfying was just sad. Traffic was light as I passed through Norfolk, the familiar sight of naval vessels in the harbor, reminding me that I was returning to my real world, the world where my value wasn't questioned, where my contributions were recognized and appreciated. Within an hour, I'd be briefing an admiral about operational protocols that could affect national security. The contrast with the family drama I'd just left behind was stark. My phone rang again, and this time I recognized the number as my executive officer at Naval Special Warfare Command. Commander Torres, I answered, putting the call on speaker. Ma'am, I just wanted to confirm you'll be here for the 1900 briefing with Admiral Peterson. There have been some developments with the joint training exercise that require immediate attention. I'm en route now, ETA, about 45 minutes. Can you give me any preview of what this is about? Not over an unsecured line, ma'am, but I can tell you that your recommendations for improving maritime infiltration protocols have attracted attention at levels above Admiral Peterson. This briefing might be about more than just training modifications. Levels above Admiral Peterson. That meant flag officers at the Pentagon. Possibly even civilian leadership at the Department of Defense. Whatever was happening, it was significant enough to involve people who didn't typically concern themselves with training protocol details. Understood. I'll be there with time to spare. Ma'am, there's one more thing. We've had some media inquiries about you today. Something about a family event? I told them we don't comment on personnel matters, but they seemed unusually persistent. The story was spreading beyond local news, apparently. Someone must have contacted military reporters, thinking they had a human interest story about a decorated officer reconciling with her family. They had no idea how complicated the actual situation was. It's nothing operational, I assured him. Just personal family matters that got more public attention than anyone expected. Copy that, ma'am. See you in 1900. I ended the call and continued driving through the familiar landscape of southeastern Virginia. Naval bases, defense contractors, communities built around military service. This was my world, had been my world for over 2 decades. The people here understood dedication, sacrifice, the sometimes difficult choices that came with putting duty before personal comfort. As I approached the gate at Little Creek, I felt the familiar sense of coming home. The security guards recognized my credentials, waved me through with respectful efficiency. The base was quieter than usual for a Saturday evening, but there was still activity around the Special Operations training facilities. SEALs don't observe regular schedules, they train when training is needed. I parked outside the Special Warfare Command building and took a moment to center myself. In a few minutes, I'd be discussing classified operations with senior leadership. The emotional turbulence of the afternoon needed to be compartmentalized, set aside so I could focus on the mission at hand. My reflection in the car's side mirror showed a professional woman in her early 40s, composed and confident. The awkward 18-year-old who'd left home with a duffel bag was gone, replaced by someone who'd earned her place in rooms where important decisions were made. My family was finally learning who I'd become, but the military had known for years. As I walked toward the building entrance, I passed a group of young SEALs heading to evening training. They nodded respectfully, probably recognizing me from previous training sessions. These were the men I helped prepare for missions that most people couldn't imagine, operations that required precision, courage, and absolute trust in their training. "Evening, ma'am," one of them said. "Evening, gentlemen. Stay sharp." "Always, ma'am." This was the world where I belonged, where my contributions mattered, where respect was earned through competence rather than conformity. Whatever Admiral Peterson wanted to discuss tonight, I was ready for it. The chaos at the VFW hall already felt like something that had happened to someone else in a different life. I badged into the building and headed toward the briefing room, my mind shifting into operational mode. Behind me, my phone continued buzzing with messages from a family that was finally trying to understand who their daughter had become. But ahead of me was work that mattered, responsibility that couldn't wait for family reconciliation. The door to the briefing room was marked with classification warnings. Inside, Admiral Peterson was waiting with answers to questions I didn't even know I should be asking. Admiral Peterson was already seated at the polished conference table when I entered the briefing room at 1855 hours. He was a man in his late 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of steady gaze that came from decades of making life-and-death decisions. Beside him sat Captain Williams, whom I recognized as the liaison between Naval Special Warfare and the Pentagon, and a woman in civilian clothes who was introduced as Dr. Sarah Blackwood from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," Admiral Peterson said, standing to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming on short notice. I understand you were at a family event." "Yes, sir, not a problem." "Please have a seat. What we're about to discuss is classified at the highest levels." I settled into my chair, notepad ready, mind focused entirely on whatever briefing was about to unfold. The emotional chaos of the afternoon felt like a distant memory, replaced by the sharp concentration that came with handling sensitive military matters. "Commander," Admiral Peterson began, "your recommendations for improving maritime infiltration training protocols have been reviewed not just by Naval Special Warfare Command, but by Joint Chiefs at the Pentagon. Your innovations in psychological preparation and tactical adaptation have caught the attention of some very senior people." Dr. Blackwood leaned forward. "Lieutenant Commander, we've been monitoring the implementation of your training modifications across multiple SEAL teams. The results have been extraordinary. Mission success rates have improved by 18%. Training injuries are down 25%. Most significantly, psychological resilience metrics show marked improvement in high-stress operational environments." The statistics were gratifying, but I sensed this briefing wasn't just about congratulating me on effective training protocols. Admiral Peterson's expression was too serious, too focused for a routine performance review. "Sir, I appreciate the feedback, but I suspect there's more to this meeting than performance metrics." Admiral Peterson nodded approvingly. "You're right. Commander, we're facing a situation that requires your specific expertise. There's been an incident in the South China Sea. Chinese naval forces intercepted a reconnaissance mission near the Spratly Islands. 3 SEALs were captured." The words hit me like cold water. Captured SEALs meant international complications, potential torture, possible execution if diplomatic efforts failed. It also meant that rescue operations would be necessary, operations that would require the absolute best training and preparation. "What's the status of diplomatic efforts?" I asked. Captain Williams answered, "State Department is working through official channels, but intelligence suggests the Chinese are using this as leverage in ongoing territorial disputes. They're claiming the SEALs were in territorial waters conducting illegal surveillance." "Were they?" Admiral Peterson's expression didn't change. "That's classified above your current level, Commander. What matters for our purposes is that we need to prepare for multiple contingencies. including rescue operations. Dr. Blackwood opened a folder and slid several documents across the table. This is where your expertise becomes critical. Any rescue mission will require infiltration techniques that push our current capabilities to the absolute limit. We need training protocols that can prepare teams for scenarios we've never attempted before. I scanned the documents quickly, recognizing immediately that they were describing operational challenges of unprecedented complexity. Deep water infiltration in hostile territory, extraction under fire, sustained combat in environments where conventional backup would be impossible. Ma'am, these scenarios are beyond anything we've trained for, I said honestly. Exactly, Admiral Peterson replied. Which is why we need you to develop new protocols. Fast. How fast? We need preliminary training frameworks within 72 hours. Full implementation within 2 weeks. 2 weeks to develop training that could mean the difference between successful rescue and catastrophic failure. 2 weeks to create protocols that would prepare young men for missions that might cost them their lives if I made the wrong decisions. Sir, I'll need access to intelligence briefings about the operational environment. I'll need to consult with teams who have experience in similar conditions. I'll need resources that typically take months to requisition. You'll have whatever you need, Dr. Blackwood said immediately. This has been designated Priority Alpha by the Secretary of Defense. Every resource of the Department of Defense is at your disposal. Priority Alpha. The highest possible classification for military operations, reserved for situations that could affect national security at the broadest level. Whatever was happening in the South China Sea was more significant than a simple reconnaissance mission gone wrong. Commander, Admiral Peterson continued, I'm temporarily reassigning you to a special task force reporting directly to my office. Your current duties are being transferred to other personnel effective immediately. For the next month, your only job is to solve this problem. The magnitude of what they were asking began to sink in. They weren't just requesting my expertise. They were betting the success of a potential rescue mission on my ability to innovate under pressure. The 3 captured SEALs, their families, the broader implications of the international incident, all of it could hinge on training protocols I was being asked to create in less than 2 weeks. Sir, I understand the urgency, but developing effective training for scenarios in this complex typically requires extensive testing, refinement, and multiple iterations. Rushing the process could compromise the safety of the teams we're trying to prepare. We're aware of the risks, Captain Williams said. But we're also aware that doing nothing guarantees failure. Commander, your psychological evaluation protocols have revolutionized how we prepare our people for extreme stress. Your tactical innovations have improved success rates across the board. If anyone can solve this problem, it's you. My phone, which I'd silenced for the briefing, was lighting up with notifications. Through the slight gaps in the conference room blinds, I could see the base continuing its normal operations, oblivious to the crisis being discussed in this room. Somewhere in the South China Sea, 3 American servicemen were being held in conditions I didn't want to imagine. What kind of support team will I have? I asked. Dr. Blackwood consulted her notes. We're assembling a team of 12 specialists, maritime warfare experts, psychological operations personnel, intelligence analysts, and 4 SEAL team leaders with relevant operational experience. You'll be the senior officer in charge of protocol development. Senior officer in charge. They weren't just asking for my expertise. They were putting me in command of the entire training development effort. It was the kind of responsibility that could define a career, the kind of assignment that either led to promotion and recognition or spectacular failure and professional disgrace. When do I meet the team? Tomorrow morning, 08:00 hours. We've cleared classified workspace in Building 47. Everything you need will be set up and ready. Admiral Peterson stood, signaling the end of the briefing. Commander, I want to be clear about something. What we're asking of you is unprecedented. The timeline is brutal, the stakes are enormous, and the margin for error is essentially 0. If you have any doubts about your ability to handle this assignment, now is the time to say so. I looked at this room full of senior leaders who were entrusting me with a mission that could affect international relations and determine whether 3 captured Americans came home alive. 6 months ago, my own family couldn't understand why I'd chosen military service. Tonight, the Department of Defense was asking me to lead an effort that could prevent an international crisis. Sir, I understand the assignment and accept the responsibility. Those SEALs are counting on us to bring them home. I won't let them down. I know you won't, Commander. That's why you're here. I left the briefing room with a secure laptop, classified files, and the weight of 3 captured lives on my shoulders. The hallways of the Special Warfare Command building were quiet at this hour, most personnel having finished their duties for the day. But for me, the real work was just beginning. I had less than 72 hours to develop training protocols that could determine whether a rescue mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. My quarters on base were spartanly furnished, but functional. As I settled at the small desk and opened the classified laptop, my personal phone buzzed incessantly with notifications I'd been ignoring since leaving the VFW hall. The contrast was jarring. On one screen, intelligence reports about captured SEALs and potential international incidents, and on the other, a stream of messages from a family that had just discovered I existed. I scrolled through the notifications quickly, text messages from Emma, Jake, and my parents, missed calls from local reporters, and even some national news outlets. Someone had posted about the retirement ceremony incident on social media, and it was apparently gaining traction as a human interest story about military families and misunderstanding. One message from my mother stood out. "Sarah, please call. The reporters are saying terrible things about us. They're making us look like awful people who abandoned their daughter. We need your help to tell our side of the story." Our side of the story. Even now, even after witnessing my professional credibility firsthand, she was still thinking in terms of managing perceptions rather than acknowledging reality. They weren't awful people who had abandoned their daughter. They were confused people who had made a 23-year mistake and were now facing the consequences. I powered down the personal phone and focused on the classified materials spread across my desk. Intelligence briefings about the South China Sea, detailed reports on Chinese naval capabilities, psychological profiles of captured personnel, and preliminary assessments of potential rescue scenarios. This was work that mattered. Work that could save lives and prevent international crises. The captured SEALs were identified as Petty Officer First Class Marcus Rodriguez, Chief Petty Officer David Kim, and Petty Officer Second Class James Patterson. All experienced operators with multiple deployments, all trained according to protocols I had helped develop. Now they were depending on me to create new training that could bring them home. I spent the next 4 hours immersed in operational details, tactical scenarios, and environmental challenges. The proposed rescue operations would require infiltration techniques beyond anything currently in our training repertoire. Deepwater approaches in heavily monitored territory, extraction under hostile fire, sustained operations without conventional support or backup. At 0200 hours, I finally allowed myself a break. The base was completely quiet now, just security personnel and a few insomniacs like myself working late on classified projects. I made coffee in the small kitchenette and returned to my desk, where my personal phone had somehow turned itself back on and was displaying dozens of new notifications. Against my better judgment, I checked the messages. Jake had sent several texts updating me on the media situation. Channel 12 ran a story about you tonight. They interviewed people from the retirement ceremony. Mrs. Davidson said some really nice things. Another message. Mom is convinced this is going to ruin Dad's reputation in the community. She wants you to issue some kind of statement. Emma had sent a different kind of message. I've been reading about your military service online. Sarah, I had no idea. I'm so ashamed of how we treated you. The things you've accomplished. I don't even know how to apologize for 23 years of being wrong about everything. But it was my father's message that stopped me cold. Sarah, I understand if you never want to speak to us again. But I want you to know that I spent tonight reading everything I could find about your military career. Citations, commendations, articles about your innovations in training. I realized that while I was telling people I had 2 children, My third child was serving our country with distinction. I failed you as a father, and I failed myself as a man who claims to value service. If you can ever forgive me, I'd like the chance to be proud of you publicly instead of ashamed of my own ignorance." The message was more honest and self-aware than anything I'd received from my family in decades. But it was also 23 years too late, and I had more immediate concerns than family reconciliation. 3 Americans were being held in hostile territory, and developing their rescue protocols was more important than processing my father's belated recognition. I was about to put the phone away when it rang. The caller ID showed Captain Rodriguez. "Commander Mitchell," I answered. "Ma'am, I apologize for calling so late, but I wanted to check on you. I've been thinking about what happened at that retirement ceremony today, and I'm concerned that my intervention might have created complications for you." "Captain, your intervention was perfectly appropriate. My family needed to hear the truth about my service from someone they couldn't dismiss or ignore. Even so, I understand there's been media attention. Are you handling that okay?" I looked at the classified files spread across my desk, the intelligence reports about captured personnel, the operational scenarios that would determine whether 3 families got their sons back alive. "Captain, I appreciate your concern, but I have bigger problems than family drama and local news stories right now." There was a pause on the line. "Ma'am, is this about the briefing with Admiral Peterson?" "I can't discuss specifics, but let's just say that my personal life has been temporarily postponed in favor of more pressing national security concerns." "Understood. But Commander, for what it's worth, watching you handle that situation today with such grace and professionalism, while your family was falling apart around you, that was impressive. You've clearly learned to operate under pressure without losing your composure." "Thank you, Captain. That means more than you know." After ending the call, I returned to the operational files with renewed focus. Captain Rodriguez was right about operating under pressure. The skill I'd developed managing family rejection and personal disappointment had actually prepared me for exactly this kind of high-stakes professional challenge. While my family had been questioning my choices, the military had been teaching me to make decisions that affected lives and missions. At 0400 hours, I finally had the outline of a preliminary training protocol. It would require innovations in underwater approach techniques, modifications to extraction procedures, and entirely new psychological preparation methods for sustained operations in hostile territory. It was ambitious, complex, and potentially dangerous to implement quickly. But it was also the best chance those 3 captured SEALs had of coming home alive. As dawn approached, I allowed myself one final check of my personal phone. A new message from Emma. "I know you're probably busy with important military things, but I wanted you to know that I'm proud to be your sister. I always should have been." I typed back quickly. "Thank you. That means something, but right now I have work to do that can't wait for family conversations." Her response came immediately. "I understand. Go save the world, Sarah. We'll be here when you're ready to talk." For the first time in 23 years, my family was offering me exactly what I needed: recognition without demands, support without conditions, and space to do the work that defined my life. It had taken a very public confrontation and media attention to get there, but they were finally beginning to understand who their daughter had become. I powered down the personal phone again and returned to the classified laptop. 3 Americans were counting on me to develop training that could bring them home. Everything else, including family reconciliation, would have to wait. 3 weeks later, I stood in the same conference room where Admiral Peterson had first briefed me on the captured SEALs, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. The rescue mission had been executed flawlessly. All 3 captured personnel had been recovered alive and unharmed, extracted from a heavily fortified facility in the South China Sea, using training protocols that my team had developed in those frantic 72 hours. The after-action reports were spread across the table like evidence of a miracle. Every aspect of the operation had gone according to plan. The maritime infiltration techniques we'd innovated had allowed the rescue team to approach undetected. The psychological preparation protocols had kept them calm and focused under extreme pressure. The extraction procedures had gotten everyone out safely, despite heavy enemy resistance. "Commander Mitchell," Admiral Peterson said, his voice carrying a weight of satisfaction I'd rarely heard from senior officers. I've been in the Navy for 32 years, and I've never seen a more successful integration of new training protocols under operational conditions. What your team accomplished was extraordinary. Dr. Blackwood was reviewing final casualty reports. 0 American losses, minimal injuries, complete mission success. The training you developed didn't just work. It exceeded every projection we had for effectiveness. The praise was gratifying, but I was more focused on the personnel recovery reports. Petty Officer Rodriguez, Chief Kim, and Petty Officer Patterson were all back on American soil, debriefed and cleared for return to duty. 3 families had their sons back. 3 careers that could have ended in captivity or worse were continuing. That mattered more than any commendation or recognition. The real credit goes to the teams that executed the mission, I said. My job was just to give them the tools they needed. Tools that didn't exist before you created them, Captain Williams pointed out. Commander, what you've accomplished here has implications far beyond this single operation. The Defense Department wants to implement your innovations across all Special Operations training. All Special Operations training. Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, Air Force Pararescue, Navy SEALs. Thousands of personnel would be trained using protocols I developed in a conference room under crushing time pressure. It was the kind of career-defining achievement that most military officers could only dream of. Admiral Peterson was reviewing a folder marked with the highest classification levels. Commander, there's one more matter we need to discuss. Your performance during this crisis has been noted at the highest levels of the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense has personally recommended you for promotion to full commander, effective immediately. Full commander. The promotion I'd been working toward for years, achieved through developing training that had literally saved lives. It was vindication of every sacrifice I'd made, every long night I'd spent developing better ways to prepare our people for dangerous missions. Sir, I'm honored by the recommendations. It's more than a recommendation, Commander. It's a done deal. Your promotion ceremony is scheduled for next Friday. Admiral Morrison from the Pentagon will be conducting the ceremony personally. Dr. Blackwood closed her folder and smiled. There's also another matter. The Joint Chiefs are creating a new position, Director of Advanced Training Protocols for Special Operations. It's a Pentagon assignment reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. You're the only candidate they're considering. A Pentagon assignment. Washington, D.C. The kind of position that shaped policy for the entire military, that influenced how America prepared its most elite warriors for the most dangerous missions. It was an opportunity that came along once in a generation. Ma'am, that's an incredible opportunity. When would such an assignment begin? 6 months from now. Time for you to finish current projects and transition responsibilities. But Commander, or should I say soon-to-be Commander, this would put you on track for flag officer rank within 5 years. Admiral Peterson thinks you could be wearing stars before you're 50. Admiral rank before 50. It was a success beyond anything I'd imagined when I left home with a duffel bag 24 years ago. While my family had been telling people they had 2 children, their 3rd child had been climbing to the highest levels of military leadership. The meeting concluded with handshakes and congratulations, but as I walked back to my quarters, I found myself thinking not about promotions or Pentagon assignments, but about the phone calls I'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. My personal phone had been powered down since the night I'd developed the rescue protocols, but I knew that when I turned it back on, there would be dozens of messages from a family that was probably still trying to process what they'd learned at that retirement ceremony. In my quarters, I finally powered on the personal phone. As expected, there were numerous messages, but they weren't what I'd anticipated. Instead of demands for attention or complaints about media coverage, most of the messages were simply updates on their lives, shared without expectation of response. Emma had sent photos of her daughters at soccer games, with captions like, "Thought you might like to see your nieces playing sports." Jake had forwarded news articles about military innovations, adding comments like, "Reminded me of the kind of work you do." My mother had sent a message about my father's recovery from his heart attack, ending with, "We know you're busy with important work, but wanted you to know he's doing well." But it was my father's most recent message that made me pause. "Sarah, I don't know if you're reading these, but I wanted you to know that I've been volunteering at the VA hospital. Talking to veterans, trying to understand the kind of service you've dedicated your life to. I'm learning that my daughter chose a path of honor, and I'm sorry it took me 24 years to recognize that. The messages showed a family that was finally trying to understand rather than judge, to learn rather than dismiss. They weren't demanding my attention or expecting immediate forgiveness. They were simply sharing their lives and waiting patiently for me to decide if I wanted to be part of them again. I scrolled to my father's contact and typed a brief message. "Dad, I'm proud of your work at the VA. Service takes many forms. Maybe we can talk soon." His response came within minutes. "I would like that very much. Congratulations on your promotion, Commander. I saw the announcement in the Navy Times." He'd been following my career in military publications, learning about my achievements through official channels since I wasn't sharing them personally. It was both touching and heartbreaking. A father trying to know his daughter through press releases and military news because he'd forfeited the right to hear it directly. I typed one more message. "The promotion ceremony is next Friday at 1400 hours. Norfolk Naval Base. If you'd like to attend, I can arrange guest passes for the family." The response came immediately. "We'll be there. Thank you for giving us the chance to finally celebrate you properly." I stared at that message for a long time. After 24 years of silence, my family would finally witness one of my professional milestones. They would see me in dress blues, surrounded by admirals and senior officers, being promoted for work that had saved American lives. They would understand, perhaps for the first time, who their daughter had become while they weren't paying attention. It wouldn't erase 24 years of rejection and misunderstanding. It wouldn't immediately heal the wounds of being disowned for choosing service over conformity. But it was a beginning, a chance for them to see me not as the disappointment they'd imagined, but as the woman I'd actually become. Outside my window, the sun was setting over the Chesapeake Bay, and somewhere in the world, newly trained special operations personnel were using protocols I'd developed to keep themselves and their teammates safe. That was the work that defined me, the mission that gave my life meaning. Everything else, including family reconciliation, was secondary to that purpose. But for the first time in decades, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, I could have both. Friday arrived with perfect Virginia weather, clear skies and a gentle breeze off the Chesapeake Bay. I stood at attention in my dress blues as Admiral Morrison approached with the gold oak leaves that would mark my promotion to full commander. The ceremony was being held on the parade grounds at Norfolk Naval Base, with hundreds of military personnel in attendance. But my eyes were fixed on a small group seated in the front row of the guest section. My parents, Jake, Emma, and her 3 daughters, all dressed formally and watching with expressions I'd never seen before. Pure pride, unmixed with embarrassment or confusion. By direction of the President of the United States and the Secretary of the Navy, Admiral Morrison announced, his voice carrying across the silent parade grounds. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell is hereby promoted to the rank of Commander, United States Navy." As he pinned the new insignia to my collar, I heard something that made my heart skip. From the guest section came the sound of enthusiastic applause, but above it all, I could hear my father's voice calling out clearly, "That's my daughter." After 24 years of silence, he was finally claiming me publicly, proudly, without reservation. The ceremony concluded, and as I walked toward my family, 12 SEALs from the teams I'd trained stepped forward in perfect formation. In unison, they snapped to attention and saluted. "Admiral, ma'am," the senior chief announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "thank you for bringing our brothers home." My mother gasped audibly. My father straightened to his full height, his eyes bright with tears. They finally understood. Their daughter wasn't a failure who'd thrown her life away on some misguided military fantasy. She was a commander who'd saved lives, shaped policy, and earned the respect of the nation's most elite warriors. As my family surrounded me with congratulations and my nieces looked at me with newfound awe, I realized something profound. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving your family wrong. It's giving them the chance to finally see they were wrong and choose to be better. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of triumph over adversity. Have you ever been underestimated by the people closest to you? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire our next video. Remember, your worth isn't determined by who believes in you, but by what you accomplish when nobody's watching. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of resilience and redemption.